Remember, language hasn't evolved at all for 50,000 years since humans left Africa. A small group left Africa, spread all over the world, and we're all basically identical. If you take an infant from an Amazonian tribe that hasn't had other human contact for 20,000 years and bring it up in Baltimore, it'll speak straight Baltimore English, end up here studying physics, and conversely. So there doesn't seem to be, there are individual differences among humans, but there don't seem any significant or almost detectable group differences. So nothing's happened for about 50,000 years. And if you go back about 50,000 years before that, there isn't really any evidence that there was language. In that, of course, we're beyond, as I said, you don't have comparative evidence, you don't have fossil evidence, but you do have artifacts. And in fact, there was a big kind of creative explosion that took place somewhere in that window, let's say maybe 35,000 years ago. A sudden explosion of symbolic representation, complex social structures, observations, apparent observations of astronomical events, all kinds of things just suddenly happened. In general, it's usually assumed, we don't have direct evidence, that this must have been connected with the sudden emergence of language. And notice that it's very sudden in evolutionary times. Now, you can double or triple the numbers. It's still a flick of an eyelash in evolutionary time. So somewhere in a very small window, something happened, and then nothing happened afterwards. That part we're pretty sure of. Well, what would have happened? Whatever happened, unless there's some mechanism that biology hasn't discovered yet, whatever happened would be some rewiring of the brain, some mutation that caused a rewiring of the brain. And that rewiring of the brain would have given this mechanism, this computational mechanism that allows these things to happen. But a rewiring of the brain, a mutation takes place in an individual, not in a group. Okay, that's obvious. So this happened to somebody, some person in some small hunter-gatherer group underwent this change. That person had the capacity to do what we all do internally, but without the externalization, because there was nobody to talk to. So there's no reason to think it was externalized at all. It's just that whatever's going on in our heads that is pre-linguistic, that we get bits and pieces of it when we think about, that would have been available for one person. Well, if there's any selective advantage to that, say ability to plan and so on, it could proliferate in a small group there over generations. There could be enough people who had that, so it would make some sense to interact. But then at that point you would get externalization. But externalization is a very tough process. There's this internal thing in the head which developed without any external pressures, okay, because there were no selectional pressures on it, almost by definition. So it's kind of like a snowflake, something that just develops because that's the way nature works. You have this thing in the head, you have a sensory motor system which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years and has nothing to do with it, and you have to match them up. That's a complicated process. In fact, that's where practically, as far as we know, that's where almost all the complexity of language is. When you learn a language, that's what you learn. A child who's acquiring a language, that's what they acquire. Nobody teaches you, you don't learn the kinds of things I mentioned at the beginning, which are probably just part of the way the snowflake works. And then of course, once you have the externalization, you could have some kind of communication. So, even from the minimal evolutionary speculation, and of course it's all speculation, it looks like a plausible scenario. It incidentally has looked that way to some of the leading evolutionary biologists too. It's hard to think of an alternative, in fact. So yeah, it does kind of sound intuitive that People ought to be communicating all the time. What else do they need language for? But like a lot of obvious things, when you look at it, it just doesn't seem to be true.
My own studies in language and human cognition demonstrate, to me at least, what remarkable creativity ordinary people have. The very fact that people talk to one another is a reflection, just in the normal way, I don't mean anything particularly fancy, reflects deep-seated features of human creativity, which in fact separate human beings from any other biological system we know.
Noam Chomsky, theorist of language and political activist, has had an extraordinary career. I can think of none like it in recent American history, and few anywhere at any time. He has literally transformed the subject of linguistics. At the same time, he's become one of the most consistent critics of power politics in all its protean guises. Scholar and propagandist, his two careers apparently reinforce each other. In 1957, he published his Syntactic Structures, which began what has frequently been called the Chomskyan Revolution in linguistics. Like a latter-day Copernicus, Chomsky proposed a radically new way of looking at the theory of grammar. Chomsky worked out the formal rules of a universal grammar which generated the specific rules of actual or natural languages.
The general approach I'm taking seems to me rather simple-minded and unsophisticated, but nevertheless correct.
Later he came to argue that such systems are innate features of human beings. They belong to the characteristics of the species and have been, in effect, programmed into the genetic equipment of the mind like the machine language in a computer.
One needn't be interested in this question. Of course, I am interested in it. And the interesting question from this point of view would be, what is the nature of the initial state? That is, what is human nature in this respect?
That in turn explains the
astonishing. You try the next one. Facility.
That in turn explains the astonishing facility that children have in learning the rules of natural language, no matter how complicated, incredibly quickly, from what are imperfect and often degenerate samples.
Complicated. It's a complicated word. You know what complicated means? It means it's complicated.
If, in fact, our minds were a blank slate and experience wrote on them, we would be very impoverished creatures indeed. So the obvious hypothesis is that our language is the result of the unfolding of a genetically determined program. Well, plainly, there are different languages. In fact, the apparent variation of languages is quite superficial. It's certain, as certain as anything else, is that humans are not genetically programmed to learn one or another language. So you bring up a Japanese baby in Boston, it'll speak Boston English, and you bring up my child in Japan, it'll speak Japanese. And that means that from that it simply follows by logic that the basic structure of the languages must be essentially the same. Our task as scientists is to try to determine exactly what those fundamental principles are that cause the knowledge of language to unfold in the manner in which it does under particular circumstances. And incidentally, I think there is no doubt the same must be true of other aspects of human intelligence and systems of understanding and interpretation and moral and aesthetic judgment and so on.
There are a good many people, specialists in the field, as you know, who believe that language is simply a matter of training, that a child can be trained to speak and that there's nothing unique about this. You, I know, feel that there's something more than simply training. Why do you feel that there's something more to learning language than simply training?
Well, first of all, it's worth mentioning that most overwhelmingly people learn language without training. I mean, if you simply immerse a child in a situation in which language is spoken, he acquires the system.
But it's more than a response to the stimuli of the person around him speaking.
Well, the most obvious and sort of gross fact about language, which shows that, I think, is the innovative, creative character of it. I mean, every child is capable of understanding and producing very complex structures which have no simple relationship, no point-by-point relationship, no
no relationship on the basis of analogy, let's say,
What
to
do you
the
mean by
experience that he's
the
presented.
generative, creative structures of language?
Just that you can, as we're talking, we say new things, which we may not have said before. We hear new things.
I mean,
that we
language
may
is,
not have
well,
heard
as we
before.
talk, there's very little repetition in what we say.
Well, if you really were to see how little repetition there is, you can, let's say, take a book or a newspaper or a library, for that matter, and search for repetitions of phrases or sentences and so on. They occur, but rarely so. I mean, there are particular subparts of language, say greetings or conventional utterances of one sort or another, that do repeat frequently, but these are incidentally often marginal in their structure. For example, a sentence like "How do you do" has a structure which is, in fact, unique. It's not the structure of any English sentence. And we don't create new sentences of that type. That's just a ritualized utterance.
Yeah.
But most of our linguistic interchange is, in fact, highly innovative. And of course, it's not just random. I mean, it's innovative, but somehow appropriate to situations.
It doesn't necessarily follow the rules that we were all taught in school of a subject and a predicate or a noun and a verb. I mean, I would have the impression that somehow in my schooling I was taught to do what it is that I do now.
Yeah, well, people have that impression, but the reason is that the actual rules of language, which certainly are not taught in school, because in fact nobody even knows them to this day, are totally unconscious. I mean, what you're taught in school is some relatively superficial set of generalizations about some of the products.
Are they important? Is it important to know that?
Well, I think it'd be important to know it, but the point that has to be stressed is that first of all, that everyone knows, speaks a language very fluently and a very rich language before he ever goes to school. And furthermore, even if you wanted to teach somebody the rules of language, you wouldn't be able to do it because the rules are largely unknown. We're just barely beginning to discover them. It seems to us that there's no problem in speaking, just as it seems to us that there's no problem in, let's say, walking. But if we were to try to design an automaton, let's say, that would walk or ride a bicycle or identify a person. I mean, for example, you look at me from one point of view, and if I turn my face, you could still recognize me.
Yeah.
That's not so easy to do. I mean, we can do it because we have some special unknown capacities for perceptual identification. Well, in the case of language, too, we have this whole totally unconscious set of intricate mechanisms.
I mean, something's built into the system.
Well, I have no doubt that most of the richness of the structure of language is just the biological property of the organism. Can't be taught any more than you can be taught to have two arms and two legs.
You've got no way that you can X-ray it or
well,
put your finger on it.
At the moment, neurophysiology is not in a state where one can detect the physical structures that underlie linguistic use. I mean, only rather gross things are known. For example, it's known that language is controlled by the dominant. The brain has two hemispheres, and language is controlled by one dominant hemisphere. Incidentally, humans are, as far as I know, as far as anyone knows, the only organism that has lateralization, that has specialization of the two hemispheres. Apes don't, for example. And this is, as is well known, this is closely connected with language, and areas of the brain are known that have special relevance to various language functions. But when you get into the detailed, intricate structure of the system, it's still a mystery, entire mystery. One might say the same about learning. Nobody knows anything about the neurology of learning either, for that matter.
Now, one of the most controversial things that you've come up with is the fact that what you're saying is true not only of English, but true of all languages. There's a commonality that runs through all languages. I would have guessed that some languages were so rigidly structured that if you learned a set of 20 rules, it would take care of all situations.
Well, see, if what I just said before is true, that is, if a great deal of the structure of language is just a biological property that you bring to the learning situation, not something that you acquire in it, and if we further assume, as is unquestionably the case, that humans are not specifically adapted to learn one language or another, that is, there's no racial difference that makes it easier for you to learn this language or that language or something of that sort. From those two assumptions alone, it follows that all languages are going to be essentially uniform in that part of their structure which is biologically determined, just as there are only going to be certain possible limitations in the kind of gait that you can use when you walk. And you can't fly, no human being's going to fly. We're all going to walk. We may walk in slightly different ways, and these may be culturally determined in part, and so on. Well, I don't want to press the analogy too far. There's more differentiation in language than that. But still, I think that there is simply a biologically determined rich framework, which we can learn a lot about, incidentally. I think we can find out a good deal about it, and there are interesting theories about it, that predispose us to acquire a system of great complexity of a very specific sort on the basis of a very slight familiarity, a very slight exposure to data. See, one of the most remarkable things about acquisition of language is that the child, or for that matter an adult, has had very few seconds in his lifetime, and the total range of data available to him is rather small as compared with his ability to express himself and to produce and understand sentences and utterances and discourses as he does in his normal life. And that again indicates that that there's a rich biologically determined structure, which therefore must be uniform across languages. Now, as far to get back to your original point, whether there are languages with a small number of rules that would suffice to explain everything, certainly nothing of that sort is known. I mean, insofar as languages have been carefully studied, living languages at least, they seem basically they do differ. I mean, one language is not another language, but they don't differ as far as we know.
There still is this creative aspect in all languages.
Well,
that is generative.
that's absolutely universal. That's just a human property. I mean, which is true of every language.